In a prior video, I discussed how to activate ray tracing to the render settings window. I brought back the scene that has the glass and the sphere that are reflective, and this is saved in the Chapter 12 folder, and it's called glass.mb. In that case, the glass surface and the sphere surface are reflecting each other because ray tracing is turned on. Now, the glass is assigned to a blend that has a red color, while the sphere is assigned to a surface that has a gray color. So for the sphere, the red glass and the backdrop appears in the reflection. For the glass, the sphere is reflected along with the backdrop. The sphere winds up looking red. And that's because the color of the blend is red. Therefore, the reflection that appears on this surface competes with that red color. Therefore, everything's tinted red, including the sphere, even though the sphere is really gray. So you always get a mixture of surface color and surface texture with reflection. In that case, we talked about how to adjust materials to make the reflections more intense or less intense through the reflectivity slider. You also need to adjust what's in the render settings window next to ray tracing. So here's a ray tracing quality section where you turn ray tracing on. It has a few attributes here that are important. One's reflections, refractions, shadows, and bias. Right now we're going to deal with reflections. Reflections is a cap on the number of times that a ray is allowed to bounce around the scene. Again, with ray tracing, rays are shot out from the view of the camera and are let to bounce off various surfaces. Now, if there was no cap or limitation, that ray would bounce on forever and the render would never stop. It'd be a very expensive and very long render. Therefore, you have this slider that says, I'm going to let each ray bounce X number of times. So for instance, it's set to 1 right now, which means that it's allowed to bounce off the first surface 1 time. So for instance, a ray might come from the camera and bounce off this glass. That's 1 bounce until it hits another surface and then it stops. That's enough to give you these basic reflections here. Now, in fact, if I was to turn this down to 0, reflections is 0, and render this region, you'll see the reflections go away completely. That's because the rays are not allowed to bounce at all. They hit the first surface and die right there. Now, I can go even higher than 1. I can go up to the default maximum, which is 10, and therefore each ray is allowed to bounce off potentially 10 times. Now, if you don't see any change, it's because materials also have an attribute that relates to this. And in fact, what happens is Maya will use to lower the 2 numbers. So if reflections is high, say set to 10, it's going to look at the material and go, oh wait, the other attribute is lower. I'm going to use the lower attribute on the material. So it's really a per material option. So let's go to the hypershade. For instance, let's take a look at the glass material that's assigned to the red glass. Hide the render settings window. And there's actually an entire ray trace option section you need to look at. If you go deeper into the attribute editor, there's a ray tracing options section or rollout right here. So if you expand that ray tracing options, you have various options, various attributes. Now some of these have to do with refractions. We'll talk about that in a later video. For now, I want to look at reflection limit. This is really the same thing as reflections in the render settings window. This is the number of times a ray is allowed to bounce around. So if reflection limit is lower than reflections in the render settings window, Maya uses this. So what I can do is set this to a higher number like 10. Do this for the other glass too. Maya will use the lowest, but because reflection limit is the same as the reflections of the render settings window, again reflections, it's going to wind up using 10. Again, of the 2, reflections or reflection limit uses the lowest value. Now, each material can have its own special reflection limit, and that affects how rays bounce off its surface. But again, it's going to use the lower of the 2. Now, if they're equal, like in this case, it simply uses that number. In any case, now I have 10 here and 10 here. And we render this region. What happens is you have a deeper set of reflections. You have reflections within reflections within reflections, because the rays are allowed to bounce more times. And if I move my camera in close here to center this render using the dolly option, you'll see I have a reflection within a reflection within a reflection within a reflection. What's happening is a ray might come in and bounce off the glass, and it bounces off the sphere and comes back and bounces off the glass and bounces off the sphere and ricochets back and forth right here where the surfaces are close together. It's kind of like having a mirror reflect a mirror, reflect a mirror, reflect a mirror. Eventually go on so light rays lose energy through the atmosphere. So that's why this whole area is much more complex, is reflections within reflections within reflections, because I have up to 10 bounces. I don't have to quite go that high and go, say, to 2, re-render that region, and then I'll dolly in again. I still have a reflection within a reflection. For instance, I have a reflection of the glass over here, but within that reflection is a reflection of the sphere. It doesn't go as deep as having it set to 10. Since this is low and now set to 2, on this material I should probably go to the other material also. If I set that to 2, so both reflection limits are set to 2. A little bit cleaner result. So I still have a reflection, but that's it. Now I can always go back to the render settings window, and if that's the lowest, still use that. So if I set reflections in the render settings window to 1, that wins out. So now back to my original rendering, which is simply 1 bounce, 1 reflection. Now it's not completely realistic. In real life, reflections are recursive, but having set to 1 gives you a nice clean result without a lot of busyness. For instance, right here, the surfaces are close together. Now remember to check the reflection limit on each surface that is reflecting, because that will override your reflection setting in your render settings window.